Greetings and welcome to this week's episode of Bronx Bombers. My name is Joe Rubenstein and it is Wednesday, May 16th, and the Yankees, who started the season 9-9, proceeded to go 19-3 after that point. They have won 7 straight series against some of the very best teams in baseball, including the Angels, the Astros, the Indians, and the Red Sox. But the Yankees now possess the best record in baseball, and our roster has 4 players, Judge, Stanton, Didi, and Sanchez, with 10-plus home runs, all 4 on pace to hit 40-plus home runs this season. That's never been done. Stanton's been on an absolute tear, hitting .391 over the last 7 games, and notched his 1,000th hit last night in D.C. So the Boo Birds have flown away, my friends, at least for now, and the cheering has only just begun. You can follow us on Twitter, @BombersPodcast is the handle. You can also send us questions. We'll try to answer each and every week in our mailbag segment here on the podcast. You can like us on Facebook, subscribe to our show on iTunes or Stitcher. You can also drop us a line, 646-854-4959. And as always, you can send your comments and questions to joe@BronxBombersPodcast.com. Really, however you'd like to engage with us, we love engaging with you. Coming up a little bit later on in our Twitter poll this week, some interesting results when we asked you to rate Aaron Boone's performance so far, and I'll answer a fascinating question from one of our followers about the dumbest thing I've ever seen a player or manager do during a game. That's going to be fun. Also, he's the host of the Bronx Beat podcast. EJ Fagan will be rejoining the show. You'll hear part 1 of that conversation, and we'll go through the good, the bad, and the ugly from this last week of action. All that and more coming up on today's Bronx Bombers. Back in a moment.
Bronx Bombers Trivia. Which of these former Yankees was the only one to play with both Mickey Mantle and Don Mattingly? Was it A, Thurman Munson, B, Roy White, C, Bobby Mercer, or D, Sparky Lyle? The answer coming up a little bit later in the podcast.
And now here's Joe with this week's main thing.
You know, I'm starting to think that this segment that I began a few weeks ago, which I call The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, named after the classic spaghetti western, that this segment has magical properties. I killed Giancarlo Stanton a few weeks ago. He's on fire. I killed Betances. He suddenly morphs into vintage 2016 Betances, walks way down, strikeouts way up. I killed Neil Walker. Now you can't get him out. I killed Gardner just last week, and now he's rocketing doubles and game-winning triples all over Yankee Stadium. It's really spooky, and I'm actually kind of tempted to kill the whole team this week just to test my theory, but no, I'm not the superstitious type. I don't believe in magic, and the truth is, it's tough to come down hard on a team that's got the best record in baseball, although there are a few miscreants that we'll zero in on as we go. It was a week that featured some really inspiring wins, but also some troubling starts from our pitchers. In fact, there were only 2 quality starts this week, both of them authored by Luis Severino. Severino 4-0 with a 1.45 ERA in his last 6 starts, striking out 50 and walking 7 over 41 innings in that stretch. And Luis Severino is without question one of the very best pitchers in baseball, but we saw some letdown from the other 4, including Domingo Germán, sadly, who I was praising last week, but just had one horrendous inning against Oakland where most of the damage was done, 6 earned runs. It was a game that we came back and won in extra innings, which is really kind of a miracle since in a tie game in the 9th, Chapman loaded the bases with nobody out. I think Singleton said on the broadcast that the odds of getting out of that without a run scoring is like 17%. That sounds actually high to me, but nevertheless, we pulled it off. But look, you can't keep putting that kind of pressure on the offense to come back every game. I mean, comebacks are cool, but having to come back every game, not cool, because in the playoffs, against Verlander or Charlie Morton or Sale or Corey Kluber, whoever, you're not going to put up a 7 spot the way we have against some of these lesser pitchers. And yes, we did win the game against Verlander a couple of weeks ago, but you and I both know if that was a playoff game, Verlander was not coming out of that game after 90 some odd pitches. He just wasn't. So even in the middle of this magical run, the pitching is very much cause for concern. But let's go into it in greater depth in our segment called The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, as we take a hard look at some of the individual performances from this last week of action And we talked about Severino, but there's one other pitcher who makes this section, a reliever. And this is a name I don't believe I've ever uttered on this podcast once. He's been almost an afterthought on this team, and until recently was used pretty much exclusively to mop up innings when we were down by several runs. At least that's how Girardi used him. But he's a guy in whom Aaron Boone has showed an increasing amount of confidence, and that man is Jonathan Holder, who pulled an absolute Houdini in that second game against Boston. We ended up winning 9-6 a week ago today. Tanaka got the start against Rick Porcello, and Porcello's definitely come back to earth after a hot start. Looked very ordinary against us, and then again very ordinary against the A's on Monday. But, Boston had a lead in that Tanaka game after Hanley Ramirez hit a bomb off of a flat slider from Chad Green. Chasen Shreve comes in, allows two men to reach, second and third, one out. Game looks like it's basically in the bag for Boston. In comes Jonathan Holder, who manages to escape the jam with 0 damage, striking out Christian Vasquez on a 2-2 slider before an intentional walk to Mookie Betts to load the bases, and then inducing a Benintendi grounder up the middle to Didi. End of inning, and Holder got the win in that game, his second major league win. And there have been other great appearances. Holder this week, 3.2 innings pitched, 0 hits, 0 earned runs, 1 walk, 3 strikeouts. So that's a great job. And there's another pitcher whose name has never graced this podcast as well, who I'll mention later in our runner-up section. But the rest of our good section here is populated by hitters. Stanton, as I mentioned, hit .391 this week, but Judge had the same exact average, and he hit his 9th, 10th, and 11th home runs. That leads the team. A whopping 12 RBIs this week for Aaron Judge, and he's become an incredibly reliable situational hitter. Approaches every at-bat with a plan, and he's come through time and time again. And then there's Neil Walker. Walker, he's been an impact player on this ball club without question the past 2 weeks. After hitting just 163 through his first 80 at-bats this season, he's hitting 360 in his last 9 games, and he had that great walk-off single on Saturday. Another guy who I mentioned at the top is Brett Gardner. Gardy in his last 9 games is 11 for 33, 2 doubles, a triple, 6 RBIs, 8 walks, and just 4 strikeouts. Now, I did say last week that 2017 was very similar. Last year, he had a terrible April and then broke out in May for his best month of the season, so it looks like history may be repeating itself. And Gardy also had a really strong, really accurate one-hop throw to the plate against Oakland that was part of an inning-ending double play. Matt Olson was originally called safe, but replay review reversed that call, and Sanchez made a really good brush tag on that play. Our bad section for the second week running features Didi, who seems to have magically transformed himself from Joe DiMaggio to an automatic out in the blink of an eye. Didi this week, 1 for 27 for a batting average of .037. That's .037. And his average since that series in Anaheim has plummeted nearly 80 points. And last night was a perfect example. That last night's game was suspended, and that'll resume today at 5:05, weather permitting. But we had the bases loaded, nobody out. Didi comes to the plate. Now in April, that's probably a grand slam or bases clearing double. But last night, Didi taps meekly back to the pitcher, who throws home for the out. Honestly, it's getting painful to watch, and I'm wondering if dropping him in the order might not be a bad idea. But the ugly section this week is once again headlined by Sonny Gray. I think it's his 3rd time in this section. He's a regular, and Sonny gave an absolutely atrocious performance against his former club, the A's, on Friday. And I'll talk about Sonny Gray with EJ Fagan later in this podcast, but he's looking more and more like Matt Harvey. Not the same off-the-field issues, but a guy who's showed tremendous talent early in his career, who's become plagued by inconsistency, actually mediocrity. And yes, he had his personal catcher, Austin Romine, and the weather was great, and none of it was worth a damn. He just got tattooed by that Oakland lineup. That's a really good hitting ball club, by the way. But just 5 innings for Sonny, once again, 9 hits, 3 walks, 5 earned runs, and his ERA climbed from an ugly 6 to an unsightly 6.39. And this starting rotation, as I said, continues to be a concern for me moving forward. Tanaka, he wasn't great last night. He settled down, but he gave up those 3 runs right out of the gate, including that big home run to Rendon. Long ball continues to be a problem for him, and pitching is something I think we'll need to address before the trading deadline. We had great pitching throughout that long unbeaten streak, but I think it's regressing a bit. The runner-up to our good section section is reliever A.J. Cole, who the Yankees picked up from the Nationals last month for cash. In that come-from-behind 7-6 extra innings win against Oakland on Saturday, we'd basically run out of relievers, and in comes A.J. Cole, who was just awful in Washington earlier this year, ERA around 9, but A.J. comes in and pitches 2 scoreless innings, and he did walk the first 2 batters he faced, but he hadn't pitched at all since April 20th, I believe, so that wasn't surprising, and he settled down really well. And other than Chapman, who, as I said, pitched himself into serious trouble, the bullpen was great. Chad Green struck out the side, Jonathan Holder flawless, Dellin Betances nasty. So with Tommy Kahnle due to come back sometime this month, this bullpen could very well continue to be a major weapon moving forward through the season and into the playoffs. But A.J. Cole this week, 4 innings pitched, no hits, no earned runs, and 5 strikeouts. So great job. Finally, before I wrap this section up, I wanted to acknowledge Billy Martin's birthday. Billy Martin would have been 90 years old today. Of course, he died back in 1989 after a troubled life, it's fair to say. But as a kid in the 70s, I didn't know any of that stuff. To me, he was just the skipper, and I loved his intensity. I loved his passion for the pinstripes. I loved when he kicked dirt on the umpires. And, as flawed a human being as he was, and we're all flawed, are we not? Billy Martin was not only a great manager, but in an earlier phase of his career, a big game player during that great Casey Stengel dynasty in the 50s, MVP of the 1953 World Series. So happy birthday, Billy Martin, wherever you are, and rest in peace. We are joined this week on Bronx Bombers by E.J. Fagan, host of the Bronx Beat podcast. And if you're after really smart Yankee analysis on everything from the current roster to the farm system to transactions, look no further. I'm a subscriber, highly recommend it, Bronx Beat. EJ, it's great to have you back on the show. Sorry about your New Jersey Devils, man. They fought the good fight, but you got the Yankees for consolation. How you doing?
I'm doing pretty well, and I think the Devils were a season ahead of their time.
I love Twitter polls. I do them every week on this podcast, and you had what I thought was a great one yesterday, and your question was this, quote, what was the best Brian Cashman trade to help put together this 2018 Yankee squad? And the 4 options were: number 1, the trade of J.R. Murphy for Aaron Hicks; number 2, Aroldis Chapman for Gleyber Torres; 3 was Shane Green for Didi, total steal; and the 4th was Starlin Castro and Jorge Guzman for Giancarlo Stanton. Just reading those, it's hard not to laugh at how lopsided they are. Now, I was very tempted to answer Castro and Guzman for Stanton. I think we haven't even begun to see the dividends of that one. Green for Didi, also tempting, but ultimately my answer was Chapman for Gleyber. But tell the listeners your own answer to that poll, EJ, and why.
Yeah, my answer is Aroldis Chapman for Gleyber Torres, and I don't even think it's really all that close. So Didi, maybe in hindsight, it looks better than it was at the time. So Didi is, I think, a really good player, but I think 10 years from now we're going to look back and say Didi Gregorius was a solid, above average to good player on a very good Yankees team. He was a good piece on this Yankees team, but not a star. Whereas Gleyber Torres could be a Hall of Fame middle infielder. I mean, that doesn't mean he will be that, but there's real potential there, and we're seeing it so far in the 2 weeks that he's been in the majors. That Gleyber Torres, or 3 weeks now, it looks like the prospect that he was hyped up to be. And if he becomes that player, if he becomes the guy who can hit 320 with 25 home runs and play really good defense and all that, the sky's the limit there. That could go down as one of the best trades of all time, made better by the fact that we signed Aroldis Chapman 6 months later to a pretty solid contract and weren't going to be winning anything that year. So we gave up essentially nothing and got Gleyber Torres.
Now, we just mentioned Aaron Hicks, and Hicks is a guy that I never quite know how to assess. I mean, he's without a doubt an incredibly skilled player, tremendous defensive range, arguably the best outfield arm in the majors, steals bases, good plate discipline, power. But, then he seems to disappear for long stretches, and I characterize his year so far as good, not great. OPS just over 700, 327 on base, 15 RBIs, 17 walks, 22 strikeouts. Of course, he missed a bunch of time early on with that injury, which might help explain his inconsistency. Now, I know the Yankees are very high on him, but give me your assessment of Aaron Hicks as a player at the age of 28. What's his ceiling? And, what do you see as his future on this ball club? And secondly, Do you think the Yankees look at free agent Bryce Harper this offseason, maybe try to move Judge or Harper or maybe even Clint Frazier to center and look to move Hicks? Or do you think that Aaron Hicks is going to be our center fielder for the indefinite future?
So three questions there. So one, this was actually the trade that made me think about that poll. I think Brian Cashman pulls off these kinds of trades frequently and gets value, a player that's useful on a major league team to very good for nothing. And J.R. Murphy was essentially giving up nothing. He was our backup catcher for a year. He was okay. He was a pretty good prospect, but no one's really thought about J.R. Murphy since the day that we traded him. And Aaron Hicks, last year, when you talk about ceiling, like what is a ceiling? Last year he had a ceiling of an all-star. In 88 games, he was worth 4 wins. He had 372 on base percentage. He hit some home runs, stole some bases, played some pretty good defense. I mean, if that's his ceiling is like Adam Eaton, maybe is the comp for that ceiling. He hasn't been great this season, particularly since he came back from the injury. So he missed, I think, 2 weeks it was with, I forget what he was injured with, and has basically batted 0 since then. And so his OPS is kind of down pretty low, but even still on the season he's on track to be like a 2 to 3 win player or slightly above average center fielder, and I think that's pretty valuable. When you ask, are the Yankees going to have room for somebody like Bryce Harper going forward? I don't think they do, because I don't think that any of those guys, Harper, Judge, or Giancarlo Stanton, could be counted on to more than fake it in center field long term. And at that point, I don't think it makes sense to have someone like Bryce Harper on your team, because you're going to be DHing somebody who can be pretty valuable on defense. Is Aaron Hicks the long term solution? Well, I guess we'll have to see how he plays this season. If he plays like he did last season, he certainly is. If he kind of keeps playing like he has, the last month or so. Definitely not. And then you guys start talking about somebody. And I don't think Clint Frazier's that guy either, because I don't think he's very fast. So, at that point, maybe Clint Frazier is a short-term stopgap there. Maybe you go out and get somebody else.
Now let's talk roster crunch. I know you did a podcast on this recently, and we talked about the crowded outfield all preseason, but the infield is even more so now. Neil Walker, who was awful for most of April, has really come on the last 2 weeks. Seems like every time he's in the lineup, he's in the middle of a rally. Now just today, as we record this on Monday, we got the news that the Yankees returned Brandon Drury from his rehab assignment and immediately optioned him to AAA Scranton, which is a compliment to Miguel Andujar and how well he's played. But with Bird getting healthy and the potential return of a healthy Drury at some point, what role do you see for Neil Walker as spring turns to summer? And also, who goes down when Bird comes back? It's got to be Tyler Austin, right?
If he keeps hitting like he's hitting now, yes. I mean, Austin's season numbers are pretty good, but his numbers since he returned from the suspension have been pretty awful. You wonder if Austin's been a streaky player historically, so you wonder if there's another big streak coming. But given the lack of left-handed hitting on this team, I think you're right that Austin is the obvious guy to go down. But I wouldn't sleep on Neil Walker being that guy. Neil Walker, yeah, he's been in a lot of late rallies, and he's batted a little bit better as of late, but this is a guy who's still batting 210, 300, 257 on the season. So he's had a bad season, and a good week doesn't offset the bad weeks, and doesn't make that the good week is less predictive than the bad weeks. I think Neil Walker's pretty good. I think he'll get better. I don't think this is Neil Walker long term, but he might not be as good as some of these other options. Andujar is an interesting name, though. I think Miguel Andujar probably should go down to the minors. And I'm a little perplexed that Brandon Drury was optioned, brought back from the DL, so they've declared him healthy, and then optioned down to the minor leagues. I think the best case scenario for Andujar at this moment is basically as good as Brandon Drury. Andujar isn't taking any walks in the major leagues. He's got that great swing, and he's when he's on, he can pepper some singles and doubles and home runs. But he's not a guy who's going to hit you 40 home runs that can make up for a 290 on base percentage, which is kind of what he's doing right now. So I'm a little concerned. I don't know why Miguel Andujar is who clearly has something to learn at AAA is still in the majors.
Now, I made this point on the podcast 2 weeks ago that the Yankees and many Yankee fans may have overrated Sonny Gray when we acquired him last summer based on 2 good seasons back in 2014 and 15. Not saying we got fleeced. None of the prospects we gave up were grade A prospects, but the fact is, since 2016, Sonny Gray in 43 starts has a 4.67 ERA, and I think he's like 8 games under 500. So 2 questions. Do you agree with me that Sonny Gray, who becomes an unrestricted free agent after next season, has an inflated reputation to an extent? And secondly, if his inconsistency continues, do you think Cashman maybe tries to package him in a deal before the trade deadline if we're able to get a starter at that time?
It's an interesting question. I think you ask about center fielders of the future, and maybe we'd love to have Dustin Fowler back right now. I don't know. I think Sonny Gray is a talented pitcher, or has been a talented pitcher in the past. He has been a near ace for extended periods of time in the past. He showed flashes of that after he was traded, but ultimately, since August of last year, he's been pretty bad. And I think that the Yankees can probably do better. I have a lot of faith in Domingo Germán, and I've been recently on Twitter campaigning to free Josh Rogers from AAA, who's a AAA left-handed pitcher who looks a lot like Jordan Montgomery. And I think either of those guys have a shot to be better than Sonny Gray. Now, it's hard to be worse than Sonny Gray's been this season, but better than the reasonable version of Sonny Gray kind of at this moment. So I'm not sure what to think. I think I kind of agree with you that I think that the Yankees could probably find a taker for him. So if you designate him for assignment, they don't end up eating that salary, they end up finding somebody. I don't think they get much back in return for him, though.
We're talking to E.J. Fagan of the Bronx Beat podcast. Now, I think it's pretty clear that the three best teams in the American League, maybe in the majors, are the Yankees, the Astros, and the Red Sox. So let's talk about Houston and Boston. Clearly, the Astros have the most dominant starting rotation in baseball, but it looks to me like their offense has had a bit of a regression. In fact, not just the Yankees and Red Sox, but also the Angels, Mariners, and Indians have a higher team OPS than Houston just in the American League. Altuve does not look quite like himself. So is this just one of those classic World Series mini hangovers? And if it's not, if this is a real market correction as far as their offense, and last year was kind of an outlier, is their starting pitching so dominant that they could kind of bull their way through the playoffs on the strength of that to a second championship? What's your take on this Houston ball club, EJ?
All right, well, let's go with the pitching first. The pitching staff is scary. I don't want to face Justin Verlander twice in a 5-game series. Especially how good he looked against the Yankees when they somehow managed to beat him, or beat the Ken Giles after he came out of the game. But Garrett Cole looks amazing. I think Charlie Morton is just out of this world. When Dallas Keuchel and Lance McCullers are fighting for the fourth best spot in your rotation, there's something going very right. I think the team certainly has weaknesses on the pitching side, but I'm with you. I don't want to see that team in the playoffs for that reason. But it's an interesting question you ask about the World Series hangover, and I have a theory of this. I don't believe that the data support the notion that there is something that's as clear as a World Series hangover. What I think is clear is that teams that go to the World Series are usually having their best years, and a lot of players are performing above expectations, and then you regress to the mean. And when those players regress to the mean, all of a sudden they look like the players that they probably should be, but that's probably going to be worse than the team that won the World Series. So you look at a guy like Carlos Correa. Carlos Correa, by all accounts, is having a fantastic season, right? He's hitting .292, .374, .521. He's worth almost 2 wins, doing well on defense. He's being Carlos Correa. But that's actually much worse than he played for most of last season. He had 100 points of slugging on top of that last season. Same with guys like George Springer. Jose Altuve has had a longer term performance above his current level. He's currently slugging .406, but he's still pretty good, right? He's still playing to a 5 or 6 WAR pace. And he's 30 something, so you might expect that. So I guess the short answer is I just think that they're playing humanly, and nobody's really having that otherworldly season.
Now the Red Sox, as much as I hate to admit it, are a very good hitting ball club.
It's nasty.
Very nasty. Betts is playing out of his mind. J.D. Martinez is proving to be a good investment, at least so far. Mitch Moreland has had a surprising resurgence. It's not as deep a lineup as the Yankees 1 through 9. I think when you get to Nunez, Jackie Bradley Jr., and Vasquez, pitchers can kind of catch their breath a little, whereas the Yankees 1 through 9 are pretty merciless. But with Boston, my contention, going back to spring training, and this hasn't changed, is that our bullpen is clearly better, and our starting pitching is at least as good. In fact, as we speak, the team whip, that's walks plus hits per innings pitched, of the Red Sox and the Yankees is identical at 1.19. On-base percentage against is 297 for Boston, 293 for New York. But give me your take on the Red Sox, EJ, and if you don't mind, give us your crystal ball prediction as far as who ends up on top of what should be a really exciting divisional race.
Yeah, they're good. I think I'm going to say here's the good news for Yankee fans. The good news for Yankee fans is that Andrew Benintendi looks pretty average. And there was always this like weird world where Andrew Benintendi was the top prospect in baseball, and he's coming up early, and he looks kind of good, but he looks kind of good in the sense that like Ben Zobrist looks kind of good, right? Like he's kind of good at a lot of things, but he's not great at any one thing. But because he was young and he had been really, really good in the minors, he looked like a player who might be better than the sum of his parts. And he looks like he's exactly the sum of his parts right now. And I think that's the best possible news, because that can distract from Mookie Betts slugging 772, which is a little bit scary. I also think Rafael Devers is good news for Yankee fans. Devers looked like, a potential like Adrian Beltre level star when he came up last season. But if you actually looked at the StatCast numbers, he actually didn't look that great in terms of StatCast. There was a lot of evidence that he got a little bit lucky after he came up late in the season. That doesn't mean that he's not going to be good eventually, but he wasn't on the verge of like some MVP level breakouts, so the Yankees can kind of still match them at some of those positions as a result. I think the Red Sox are really good, but I think the Yankees are better. I think the Yankees are matching the Red Sox win for win at the moment, and they've had a lot of players underperform. Aaron Judge is playing well, but Aaron Judge actually probably has another gear that he can put into baseball. Gary Sanchez has been horrendously unlucky. I forget what his BABIP is, but it's like below 100. I mean, he's just getting nothing falling in right now, and that's going to change. Giancarlo Stanton is starting to turn it on. I think Aaron Hicks has a little bit left in him, etc. I think this Yankee team has a lot of slack that it can pick up. And that's got to be scary for a team like the Red Sox, because the Yankees have pretty much done all of their damage with Didi Gregorius, Aaron Judge, Gleyber Torres, and a couple of lucky Gary Sanchez home runs. And that's pretty scary.
Yeah, well, the other thing is the Yankees have had a significantly more difficult schedule than Boston so far, and we're still dead even.
Yeah, the Yankees ran up against some tough pitchers during that run. That's why I'm not too scared in all of the Yankees who are kind of underperforming, because it seems like they're all underperforming because Charlie Morton and Justin Verlander are kind of good. And that's not going to last into the season. The Yankees are going to get their at-bats against the AL Central soon enough.
That's EJ Fagan, host of the Bronx Beat podcast. You've been listening to part 1 of that conversation, and you can hear part 2 of that interview on the next episode of Bronx Bombers. Back in a moment.
And now the answer to today's Bronx Bombers trivia question. Which former Yankee was the only one to play with both Mickey Mantle and Don Mattingly? The answer? C. Bobby Mercer. And now here's Joe with this week's Twitter poll.
Yes, this week's Twitter poll results are in. We asked you this: how would you rate Aaron Boone's performance so far? And 43% of our followers on Twitter at Bombers Podcast said he's an okay manager. 39% said he's a good manager. 16% said he's just a Brian Cashman puppet. And 2% said he's a bad manager. Well, look, he's clearly not a bad manager. I mean, whatever the criteria for judging a manager's performance, 700 winning percentage, 16 games over 500, best record in baseball, that kind of precludes the bad manager option, in my opinion. But we're still left with that question. And I talked about this on the very first episode of this podcast, where despite some reservations, I supported the hiring of Aaron Boone. But the question is, how do you judge a manager's performance? I mean, I concluded then that the clubhouse chemistry is certainly a big factor, which, that's hard to evaluate as an outsider, but by all reports, the Yankees clubhouse this season is a very happy, relaxed place, and anyone with eyes can see that Aaron Boone is a more relaxed individual than Joe Girardi. He just is. Now, one area within games that we can evaluate is bullpen management. And I've had my differences here with Boone, as I did with Girardi, although for different reasons. I thought Girardi tended to let too much damage occur before pulling the plug on a bad relief appearance. And I think early on, at least, Boone had a tendency to tempt fate by using relievers for a second inning or even a third when there were other guys available. He did this with Betances a few times with bad results, and this week, inexplicably, he did it with David Hale in that loss to Oakland. David Hale is like the definition of a journeyman pitcher, and we clawed and scratched our way back into that game, down by a single run, and all of a sudden, David Hale is our only option for 3 innings. It didn't make sense with this team's comeback ability and multiple guys, including A.J. Cole, rested and ready to go. But having said that, it seems like recently, though, Boone's modified that approach and used guys for 1 inning exclusively. But, then, of course, we run into the question of how much autonomy he really has. And that's why I included the option that he's a Brian Cashman puppet. In other words, it's entirely possible that Cashman instructed Boone on adjusting his bullpen usage. We just don't know. What we do know is that managers in 2018 lack the autonomy they once had, and that, one source of friction between Cashman and Girardi was disagreements on roster usage. So look, based on the fact that the Yankees are performing so well, whatever Boone's role in that is, he's had some role, and based on the fact that the Yankees are clearly a very loose and happy bunch. So my answer has to be, a quarter of the way in here, that Aaron Boone is a good manager, but I have a rather large asterisk to place next to that. And this objection to Boone, which I admit is very subjective, is more of a style point than a substance point. Namely, how should I put this? Okay, I've lived and worked in New York City for 22 years, okay? I've met all kinds of people here. It's a city I know very well. I grew up just across the river in Jersey. My parents grew up here. I know the city, okay? And it's an incredibly diverse place with people from all kinds of different backgrounds and walks of life. But there are certain common denominators that I've found. And one is that New Yorkers have really good BS detectors. You can't really pull the wool over their eyes, at least not for long. So New Yorkers are candid, sometimes brutally so, and they appreciate candor. And if they don't get it, the truth or some semblance, that detector starts to tingle. And watching Boone's post-game press conferences after games where a player's played badly, especially Sonny Gray, I hear things come out of his mouth, I won't call them lies, but they're half-truths of the sort that we hear from politicians on a regular basis, which obviously that's not a compliment. Now, I understand it's part of the job to keep things positive and protect the players, and calling out Sonny Gray after a bad performance would definitely be counterproductive. But after Sonny Gray goes out against Oakland and in 5 innings gives up 9 hits, 3 walks, 2 home runs, and 5 earned runs, don't tell me his stuff was good and you were glad he was able to battle, okay? First of all, if his stuff was good and that was the result, I'd hate to see when his stuff is bad, right? I mean, what does that look like? 20 hits, 10 runs, and 5 home runs in 5 innings? I mean, the fact that he was able to battle, what does that mean exactly? Well, I'll tell you what it means. Nothing. It's a typical sports cliche. I mean, you left the guy in there for 5 innings, right? I mean, he was terrible. What choice did he have but to quote-unquote battle? What's the alternative? Walking off the mound and saying, thanks, guys, I'm all done here. Enjoy the rest of the game. I'm going to go, play some video games in the clubhouse like David Price. I mean, we all made fun of Girardi for his go-to phrase, it's not what you want, after a bad outing. But Boone's go-to phrase, he's close, is that really any better? I mean, you could argue that Girardi's was at least accurate. And I don't mean to come down too hard on Boone, but sometimes I get the impression that if Boone was describing like the worst, like the voyage of the Titanic, he'd say something like, well, look, plenty of positives. Did it reach its destination? No, but, the ship ran really well. Service was good. Running into the iceberg, not ideal. Could happen to anybody, though. And, a few more lifeboats next time and we're good to go. I mean, there's a middle ground between being super harsh on your player and being a Pollyanna. I mean, you can take optimism and positivity too far. What happens is you end up crossing over into fantasy land and you kind of damage your credibility. And I'm not saying Boone has crossed over yet, but he's at least approached that line. So I would just say long term with the fan base here, well, I won't speak for the fan base. I'll speak for myself. I'd appreciate a little more candor, frankly. This isn't Minnesota or some place like that where everyone's happy and friendly all the time and can't deal with confrontation. This is New York, and I, for one, have a pretty low tolerance for the kind of fantastical statements that Boone has been prone to make after these kinds of horrendous performances. But look, he's winning. And as long as that's the case, this sort of stuff is not going to be noticed by anybody but cranky dudes like me, frankly. But again, this isn't Minnesota. This isn't L.A. It's New York. And if Sonny Gray goes out there and gets hammered, and then afterwards you portray it as some kind of near-miss, borderline masterpiece, I'm going to smell a rat and say so. All right, from this week's mailbag, our question of the week here on Bronx Bombers comes from Johnny in Bay Ridge. And by the way, the email is joe@bronxbomberspodcast.com, or you can find us on Twitter @bomberspodcast is the handle, or leave us a message at 646-854-4959. If you have any questions you want to have us answer on any future episodes, we are more than happy to do so. And Johnny writes, I thought it was hilarious when the Mets batted out of order in Cincinnati. That was pretty funny. And that double got taken away. Even though I know it's happened at the major league level, I've never actually seen it. What's the dumbest thing you ever saw a player or manager do in a game? That is, wow. I love this question. In fact, it might be my favorite of all the ones I've answered so far. I don't know why. It's just, I find human stupidity very amusing at times. And there's definitely a plethora of baseball stupidity that's happened in my lifetime, a wealth of options to choose from. But Johnny did narrow it down somewhat by saying on the field. So that leaves out bad trades. That leaves out idiocies like Robinson Cano's decision to use performance-enhancing drugs. That story broke yesterday, and to make matters worse, Cano has a broken hand, so the 80-game suspension won't even kick in until he's off the DL. So that's very stupid. It's very selfish, and in my opinion, Robinson Cano owes a big apology to his teammates and that fan base in Seattle. But as far as on the field, I mean, this doesn't top my list, but it might be the absolute funniest dumb thing I've ever seen happen in a game. And this was back in 2009. I didn't see the game live, but the replays, made national news. The Twins were playing the Cubs at Wrigley, and Minnesota had men on first and third with one out. And the Twins batter, can't remember who it was, hit a fly ball to Milton Bradley in right field. Bradley catches the ball and just kind of stands there frozen. Like sometimes, players kind of pose after they've caught the final out of the inning. Bernie used to do it all the time. Except the drag for Milton Bradley it wasn't the final out. It was the second out. And this is on YouTube. Go check it out. You can see people in the stands screaming and pointing, throw the ball in the infield. Minnesota is scoring, but Milton Bradley, he throws the ball into the stands as a lucky souvenir for a fan to keep. It's so funny because his intentions were so generous, but he was so clueless as to the depth of his own idiocy. I mean, so only after that point does he finally realize the depth of what he's done. And he just stands there with his hands on his head as it slowly dawns on him that he'll be in every blooper video until the end of time. And I found this quote from Lou Piniella, who was managing the Cubs at the time. Piniella was no Aaron Boone, not by half. So he said after the game, quote, "You've got to be in the game. You've got to know how many outs there are. Do we need to go over the math? 1, 2, 3. I don't know what else to say." Unquote. Shockingly, Milton Bradley was not a Cub the following season. But that was in a regular season game. It was kind of an airhead mistake. But there have been stupider actual decisions made in postseason games that were far more costly. And I thought long and hard about Johnny's question and came up with 3, in no particular order. 2 involve the Yankees. So number 1, on that famous Jeter flip play in Game 3 of the 2001 ALDS against Oakland, Jeremy Giambi rounds third. Shane Spencer throws the ball to Jeter down the first base line, who flips the ball to Posada. Bang, they get Giambi. Except, if you look at the play, Jeremy Giambi chose not to slide. Why? Why did he choose not to slide? It makes zero sense. I'm not saying he definitively would have been safe if he had, but looking at the video, I'm pretty sure a well-executed hook slide and he would have been safe. But, no, he just runs directly into Posada's tag. I mean, at the time, I was so ecstatic and sort of dumbfounded by Jeter's brilliance that I didn't notice it. But why Giambi chose not to slide, I will never, ever understand. Remember, that was an elimination game. They could have knocked us out of the playoffs in that game, so that was super dumb. Dumber, though, I think, were 2 managerial decisions by 2 different Red Sox managers about 20 years apart. The more recent was committed by manager Grady Little in Game 7 of the 2003 ALCS, the game that ended with the Aaron Boone home run. And the mistake was simple. He left Pedro in for too long. I mean, like way too long. So it was 5-2 Boston heading into the bottom of the 8th. Pedro Martinez had thrown over 100 pitches. Now, look, pitch count wasn't as much of a thing 15 years ago as it is now. It was a playoff game, and it's Pedro Martinez, the most dominant pitcher of that era. I totally get sending him out there for the 8th. And he did get that first out. But then, Jeter doubles, Bernie singles, and Grady Little goes out to the mound, and like everybody in the known universe is thinking, Pedro goes out of this game. Embry was ready in the bullpen, but no, Grady Little leaves him in, and bam, Matsui double, still leaves him in. Another double to Posada that ties the game and sends it into extras, where Boone eventually ends it in the 11th. No clue what Little was thinking there. Not that I'm complaining, it was awesome for Yankee fans, but Little was fired, of course, after that season. But the other Red Sox stupidity was even more costly because, it cost them not the ALCS, but the World Series. And that, of course, was manager John McNamara's decision not to substitute for first baseman Bill Buckner in the late innings of Game 6. Buckner had 2 bad ankles. If you watch the film of that game, you can see he's not even walking. He's really borderline hobbling around. And McNamara had consistently put in Dave Stapleton as a late inning replacement throughout that year. But, in another potential elimination game where the Red Sox could have broken the curse, in New York, no less, McNamara leaves them in, thereby subjecting not only himself, but Buckner to merciless ridicule for decades. And sadly, Buckner got the worst of it. He's the guy that you see not getting down to get that easy ground ball. And McNamara later said, quote, "I felt Buckner deserved to be on the field for the victory," unquote, which, the impulse is generous, I'll give you that. But, get to 27 outs and then you worry about people's feelings. And in that case, sentiment overtook sound judgment and cost the Red Sox dearly. And I'll never forget watching that game with my mom during that entire Mets comeback. I was in 11th grade then. And she kept saying, "Are they going to do this? Are they really going to do this?" And then, when that ball went through Buckner's legs, we both just totally flipped out. It was outstanding. Neither of us were Mets fans. She's an old Brooklyn Dodger fan and now kind of a reluctant Yankee fan. And obviously I'm a huge Yankee fan. But in that series in 86, against the Red Sox, you had to pull for the Mets. It was kind of a no-brainer. But thanks, Johnny. Great question. And that'll do it for this week's episode of Bronx Bombers. Again, don't forget, you can subscribe to this podcast on iTunes or Stitcher, and please do follow us on Twitter @BombersPodcast is the handle. Like us on Facebook as well, but most of all, have faith in the Yankees. We'll see you again next week.